Hello and welcome to this video, which is going to be my updated PvP Battleground Healer build for the update 46. Of course, with update 46, what has happened is that we're now getting subclasses, which this build takes advantage of. It's very early in the update, which means that we don't know exactly what everything is going to look like in a couple of weeks. The meta hasn't said, people are still experimenting. But I'm very confident in this build being strong due to it being pretty simple and pretty cookie cutter, and I think this is going to be one of the, if not the most popular set of subclasses used on both PvE as well as PvP healers, because it is incredibly powerful. So that is why I'm releasing it now, mostly for the people who might be lost in this new update and haven't played on the PTS and haven't really dived into what this update brings. This build is going to be very easy to get into and very simple to set up, and for most people will be able to sort of utilize it, because what we're doing is essentially just combining different healing skill lines into one to make a very powerful PvP healer. So let's dive into the Superstar and take a look at what the build actually is. So Superstar is this add-on for the people who are not on PC that gives information on practically everything in the build, from the attributes to the food buffs to the stats to the CPs. We're not in this video going to dive into CPs because it's a Battleground Healer build, but I've set up the specific CPs that I'm using when I'm using this setup in Serial. So if you want to take this into Serial where champion points are activated, you can then take these champion points and that will be reasonably effective. So if you look at the bottom right corner of the Superstar, you will see the three different skill lines that we're using. We're using the Restoring Light from the Templar, the Siphoning from the Nightblade, and the Green Balance from the Warden. Because we're using skill lines from three different classes, that also means that any of these three different classes are fine as a base class for subclassing. Of course, the only time when the base class matters is class set from Infinite Archive, the scribing skill, which we're not using in this build, so that doesn't matter. And then if you want to use two or more skill lines from one specific class, because you can only scribe into or not scribe subclass into one from each. So starting on a Templar as this is, I can only choose one Nightblade skill line, and I can also use only one skill line. If I wanted to one skill lines, I would have to change the base class to one. I do recommend, if possible, to use the Warden as the base class if you have a Warden ready, because the Warden has the best scribing class script, and that is not possible to use if the Templar is the base class. So if you do have a Warden, I do actually recommend using that, because you get a better class script, and if you then want to use a scribed ability later on, you have access to that. Otherwise, it doesn't matter where you start, as long as you level up these subclasses and then you have access to the different skills. The skills are not different, or the passives are not different in any ways. That being said, let's dive into why we chose these specific skill lines. So let's start off with Restoring Light, which is the Templar baseline. Why do we use Restoring Light? The basic reason for using Restoring Light is Extended Ritual. In my opinion, this is the best healing skill in the game. It is a huge area of AoE that heals for quite a lot every 2 seconds. It is a cleanse for yourself, so when you're getting focused, you can cleanse multiple dodge or negative effects from you, as well as allowing allies to activate a synergy that is also a cleanse. So this is the main reason why we're using a Restoring Light, and it's also the reason why in previous patches I decided to play Templar over something like a Warden. We'll dive into the Warden Green Balance later, but it is, in my opinion, the best skill in the game. What we're also using, of course, is Radiant Aura and Channel Focus. I'll go into the skills a bit later. The Channel Focus is a good source of these major resistance buffs. So what we're really looking for in subclasses is also the passives, and the passives brought with the Restoring Light are quite powerful. Mending just means healing on lower health, that's okay. Then we have access to Minor Mending. Minor Mending is a really powerful buff in terms of healing done. You can see it's 8%, that's quite a lot of healing done. So having a Minor Mending at basically 100% uptime is really nice. When we talk about Wretched Vitality later, this is also one of those minor buffs that can proc what's called Rigid Vitality. So this is a really good passive. Then we have this one that gives ultimate when you're healing people. Not specifically good, but it's nice to have. And then we have the resurrection. I do not recommend in Battlegrounds resurrecting, but if you are in the case of resurrecting, having this quicker resurrect is really, really nice. So essentially we have Restoring Light just for the extended ritual. We're also going to pick up these other skills, but extended ritual is the reason why we chose to use this. Now in something that's changed, because we had Restoring Light previously, why did we go into Siphoning? This is the Nightblade's healing line, and Siphoning is really, really good for one specific reason, which is the Catalyst update passive. You gain 30 ultimate every time you drink a potion. This is buffed from previous patches. It's buffed by 50%. There used to be 20 ultimate. Incredibly powerful passive if you combine it with potion cooldown glyphs. So we wanna use potion cooldown glyphs. Of course, this is going to hurt our sustain. We're going to talk about that later. But gaining ultimate every 30 ultimate every 21 seconds is an incredible amount of ultimate every second, which means more ults and more healing done. Then we actually have a couple of other nice passives to have. Increase max magicka, that's decent. Healing done is also very nice. 6% is quite a lot when stacking with the others, of course, but it's quite a nice buff. This is, of course, requires us to have 2 skills slotted. And then we have transfer, which is even more ultimate regen. So Siphoning is a really, really good skill line for gaining ultimate. It's going to be, in my opinion, one of the most popular choices for healers in both PvP and PvE. And the reason for that is just that ultimates are either good for something like Saxiel for giving an incredible amount of buffs to your group, or they're just good for healing done. And the ultimate we're actually using now is Soul Siphon. Soul Siphon is this ult you've probably seen the other morph in a lot of bomb builds, but Soul Siphon heals your allies in a huge radius. It's 28 meters. It's a very, very, very big radius. It has a little bit of a cast time, which actually plays into the Restoring Light you saw earlier, where we have some reduction when having a cast time. So that means that when you're casting this, if you happen to be burst at the same time, you would actually reduce a lot of that damage taken. But what we're really looking for in this Soul Siphon is major vitality. Increasing healing received and damage shield strength by 12% for 4 seconds, which means if you cast Soul Siphon, all your allies are now going to take a lot more healing. You combine this with the minor mending that we saw before and a couple of the other passives that we've seen, you suddenly see a pattern of having a lot more healing modifiers stacking on top of each other, and that's why this is such a good ultimate. It's incredibly powerful, having major access to major vitality. If you're using Osis on, as we are in this build, you also have access to minor vitality, so you're really getting all the good healing done buffs, of course. The other skill that we're using in this specific tree is Sub Essence. This is a really, really good source of major vitality and sorcery, which is nice going into Rigid Vitality later. Having access to these buffs that you can proc constantly will keep your sustain up. What is nice about this skill as well is that one, it's going to constantly proc the transfer passive, which is ultimate, but it's also a good mix of having damage and healing at the same time, which means when the enemies are grouped up, you can take advantage of this skill and actually do damage as well as healing your team at the same time. The last skill line that we're actually using in this build is, of course, Green Balance. Green Balance is one of the main reasons that Warden Healer was the most popular healer in the previous patches, and it's actually just one skill that people are specifically looking for, and it's this last one: access to minor toughness. Minor toughness is just 10% free health constantly running, and 10% max health is quite a lot, especially when you're aiming for 36k. 10% on top of that is 3.6k health just sitting there. There's a lot of other good reasons to choose this skill line. Specifically, one of the skills that we're using is Spotting Seeds. That's actually a really nice ground AoE, and it also has a synergy to it that can heal people. It is the most annoying healing skill to use in the game, because once you've cast it, you can recast it to activate to heal for 9000 health. You do not want to do that, which means essentially once you've cast this skill, you cannot recast it for another 6 seconds. So you have to wait for it to run out before you can recast it again. And that's kind of the annoying part of using this skill. Another skill we're using in this skill line is Lotus Blossom. Lotus Blossom is access to Major Prophecy and Savagery, which are the critical rating buffs. The nice thing about Lotus Blossom, this is not fully leveled, but it's an incredibly long duration. So this will be, once it's leveled up, 60 seconds, an entire minute. It also makes our light attacks and heavy attacks restore health to a nearby ally or yourself. Not incredibly powerful skill in that sense. The healing done from this is not going to make any impact really. There are some other nice passives to this. Specifically this accelerated growth. When you heal someone under 40% with one of the skills from this, then that's important distinction. You gain Major Mending. Major Mending, you remember from the templates that we have Minor Mending, so we also have Major Mending. Major Mending is not only from this skill, it's actually really easy to get Major Mending on a PvP healer, specifically because if you do a full heavy attack with your Resto Staff, you will get Major Mending as well. So you have another source of Major Mending. But just getting this passively from time to time by just happenstance is really, really, really nice. So you have Minor Mending, you have Major Mending, you have Minor Vitality, you have Major Vitality. You have another source of getting healing done from just having a skill slotted as well. So overall, our healing done is increased by significant margin in this patch compared to what it was before. And we also have access to more old region, as well as a number of different buffs like the minor toughness that we didn't have access to before. So overall, we are a much more effective healer. We also have some sustain from this passive specifically, but that is actually what we're giving up in this patch. So of course, before as a Templar we had Dawn's Wrath that had a really nice cost reduction passive. We've given up that passive. We don't really have any sort of skill other than if we were using Siphon attacks that can compensate for that fully, and we'll look at that when we go into the build. So now that we've explained what are the subclassing skill lines, let's go in and talk about the build. And the build looks like this. And let's first talk about the skills actually. So you will recognize Blessing or Restoration from previously. We've also got Budding Seeds now. This is the new skill. Of course, I explained a bit about how this skill works, as well as Sap Essence. This is our source of Major Vitality and Sorcery. It's very, very important that we cast this at least every 30 seconds, but you will find yourself using this a lot more. We're of course using the Soul Siphon ult. We're actually double barring this ult because it does give healing done when slotted, so we might as well double bar it because it's actually both a good slottable and a good ultimate, so there's really no reason not to double bar this skill. But that also means that we don't have barrier on our bar anymore, which means we don't actually have a source of the Magicka 8 passive. Of course, the Magicka 8 passive gives us a lot of Magicka regen when we have support skills slotted. So we're actually starting to wear Blinding Flare. And Blinding Flare is not just there for the Magicka 8 passive, it's there for that, but it's also there because it gives us major protection. I just explained how we have become a much more effective healer by using subclassing. We essentially taken 2 trees from the skill line of Templar that wasn't very useful for us as a healer. They were good, but not incredibly useful, and put in two skill lines that are incredibly useful. But the same thing is going to happen for our opponents, which means that the opponents we are facing are also going to play a lot more optimized builds, and that means a lot more damage taken. And Blinding Flare is a source of 10% damage reduction just there for having it slotted. It's an incredibly nice skill to have slotted, and it takes up a big amount of that burst you might receive from something like a Crow build using Blast Bones along with that sort of others, or maybe a Sorcerer using the Assassination skill line to do some sort of combo. This is going to help you, and I tried to play without this Blinding Flare for a couple of PGs, and once I saw this, I really understood just how important that 10% damage reduction really is. We've already discussed Radiant Regeneration in other videos. It's one of the most powerful heals to have, and especially in 8v8 BGs, you're going to be casting a lot because you want to have this running on all allies at once. It's going to be one of your main sources of healing once you look into it. Channel focus, we've talked about this earlier. It's a sustain tool, which is important. We've of course lost a little bit of sustain this patch, but it's also the source of our major resistances. Very important this patch. Race Against Time explains itself. Extended Ritual, again, the only reason that we're actually choosing to play a Templar. Lotus Blossom, Major Prophecy and Savagery, as well as a good slottable on your back bar, and then Radiant Aura, which is, again, it's mostly a slottable, but it's a 60-second duration, so you can keep this up, and it's a nice buff of sustain to your group, but it's actually mostly here for yourself, so that you have this sustain boost at all times. So that's pretty much the bars. You could slot another ultimate on one of the bars if you felt like it, for either a slottable or maybe something like the old ultimate that we used to use, which was of course the Life Givers, which is the Restoration Staff ultimate. This is also still a very, very good ultimate, but in my opinion not nearly as good as Soul Siphon. So that was pretty much it for the skill slottables. Let's discuss what the build actually is, and the people who have watched my previous videos will recognize this build as not actually what I called the endgame build in my old video. So some things have changed. We've put more into health because this patch is a lot more damage taken, and it will be in the coming weeks even more damage taken as people optimize their builds for subclassing. So we're going 64 into health. This is despite the fact that we now have access to minor toughness. So once we've actually got that buff, we're actually closer to 40k health. So we're doing this just so that we actually can survive. You will recognize this build as the intermediate build pretty much from the previous patches. And what we don't have here is Death Dealer's Fete. Instead, we've gone for Wretched Vitality, Double Bot, Transmutation, Double Bot, as well as Osisan, which is the monster set. And Wretched Vitality is one of those sets that has to be explained because people really do not understand exactly how it works mechanically, and maybe they don't know exactly how much the uptime is going to be, and a lot of people underestimate how strong it is because they don't think it's going to be having that good uptime. So let's discuss Wretched Vitality a little bit. So Wretched Vitality is a sustain set in the sense that it gives magical recovery, stamina recovery, it gets a little bit of weapon spell damage, but it's about applying major buffs, debuffs with the duration to a target, grants you 260 magical recovery for 15 seconds. Notice the wording, applying it with a duration, which means we are not going to be proccing this by just going on our front bar, because this major protection does not have a duration, it's just while you're on your front bar. Radiant Aura is not going to have a duration by just sitting there, so we're not going to have it permanently by just having it sit there. But if we do press Radiant Aura, we do proc this. If we do press Lotus Blossom, we have a duration, so we proc this. This is also why we're going for Lotus Blossom instead of Inner Light, because Lotus Blossom will proc this, but Inner Light won't because it's just sitting there. Every time we cast Channel Focus, we proc this, and every time we cast these, we actually proc the Templar passive, which gives us minor mending, so we also proc it. Every time we cast a healing ability and we proc minor toughness, we get this. Every time we proc major mending from Budding Seeds, because people under 40% we proc this. But most importantly, and the one that's important, is the major buffs. Every time we cast Sab Instance, we proc this. Every time we cast Place of Restoration, we proc the minor one. So minor and major. These two skills are going to be your main sources of these two procs. So of course, if it's a major, we get the bigger buff. If it's a minor, we get the minor buffs. So it's like, and in total it comes out at about 500, I think, once you actually put in some buffs and so on. So it's an incredibly powerful sustain set. Why are we going for a sustain set? As I just explained, we lost some of our sustain, and also this is a patch with a lot more damage, a lot more stress, so it makes sense to scale back on the sort of buff side of healing and going back more to the basics. Of course, we're not going to go all the way back to being a quote-unquote troll tank, but we're going to scale back our build a little bit to be a little bit more selfish. Of course, when we are wearing a sustain set, it makes sense to not go for sustained food. Another thing that's happened is that we've lost sustain on our jewelry. So I talked about the RAF skill line. So we lost about 5% cost reduction. What really hurt was the jewelry, if we actually look into it. So because we're using the Siphoning skill line and we're trying to go for the passive, I can explain the passive again if you didn't remember the Catalyst passive, so the 30 ultimate, we need those potion cooldown glyphs. Of course, that means we no longer can use sustained jewelry. And that's also why we need this sustain set, so that we can somewhat come back to the same amounts of sustain that we were in previously. And that's why I recommend this specific setup. So we've lost a bit of our cost reduction, and we've lost the cooldown glyphs. We're using potion cooldown glyphs, which do give a little bit sustain, but people really overestimate how much sustain they give. They give about 73 magic per second, which roughly translates to twice that amount, so roughly 140 magic region. And compare that, that is not even a single glyph, infused glyph, in previous patches. So this is pretty much the build as the most optimized build, and I really like this build. To give some context to how powerful this build is compared to where we were in previous patches. My first time using this build in this patch, I hit double-digit millions of healing. So I think it was about 10.5 million healing done in a battleground. It was a capture the relic that lasted the entire duration, but 10.5 million healing done is incredible. For the people who haven't played a lot of PvP healers and want some context, if you're doing 3 million healing done previously, that was a pretty good battleground. So getting 10.5 is an enormous transformation. Of course, remember the context. Yes, our build is a lot better and more optimized, but so are the enemies that we are facing. And to end up this video before it gets way too long, I want to discuss the alternative build, which is of course very simple. And what we're doing is that we're just putting on this piece of jewelry, and what we're getting then is the last talk of the last daily king. This is sort of the beginner build. So if you're completely new to PvP healing and you're looking for a very friendly beginner build type of build, using the talk in the beginning helps. What is special about talk is these sets do not matter. It doesn't matter what you're using in terms of Osisan, Retro Vitality, and other skill sets. All that matters are these buffs that you're getting here. Of course, the weight, so heavy, light, heavy matters. The enchantments matter as well, but the specific sets don't matter. What we're getting then is a 15% unique reduced damage taken, 1300 weapon damage, spell damage, and a lot of recovery, which is competitive with Retro Vitality in terms of recovery. It is competitive in sort of, it's a bit more tanky, and what you also get is weapon and spell damage done. What you're losing out on is of course the transmutation that is giving your team critical resistances. One thing I haven't discussed is of course, for the people who haven't watched the previous videos, is we're going for a lot of reinforced. And the reason we're going for a lot of reinforced is that a lot of the opponents we are facing have really high damage, critical damage modifiers. The reason they have high critical damage modifiers is that they can now have several subclasses. So they can have both the Assassin skill line as well as the Arcanist skill line. And I think even one of the Necro skill lines has critical damage done. And the higher critical damage done your opponents have, the less effective impenetrable gets, and the more effective actually we're going for reinforced gets. And that's also why we're going for a lot of reinforced here, because the small light pieces are still impenetrable, and we're still going for transmutation. This is mostly to counter burst builds, so there's sort of double logic going on here. Okay, we're going for critical damage reduction because they have a lot of critical damage, and we're also not going for critical damage reduction because they do have it. So they can be a bit confusing, but it does make sense in the sense that I think the traits should be reinforced, but we should still go for transmutation to take a bit of that burst off. So to wrap up the video, There are of course two options in terms of builds. There is the one using Retrovitality, Transmutation and Osison, and as well as the last Alien King. I do recommend going for the Torque if you're completely new to PvP healing. Once you've gotten used to it and you feel comfortable, you can swap over to this build using a few more buff sets, as you're more useful to your team and you are more sort of powerful or effective as a healer using this. So that was pretty much it for this video, and thank you for watching.